This is ABC Fora.
There's a couple of stories in the book that I think really show a side of organised crime that you can find a bit humorous, if you can find humour in murder and mayhem. But there is a violent Melbourne criminal named Michael Sayers who he came up to Sydney in the early 80s to get away from the violence in Melbourne. He was actually responsible for a lot of the violence he was then trying to get away from. But he set up in Sydney he had connections in Sydney, and he set up as an SP bookmaker. He had alliances with George Freeman and the other networks, but he was an independent SP bookmaker, and he was also a major heroin distributor. He also had another problem though. He was also a huge gambler. That gambling affected the way he ran his SP business, and it wasn't too long before he was in trouble financially. He owed a lot of people money, including his drug supplier. He owed a lot of money. A couple of the SP bookmakers that he'd laid off bets with and whom he hadn't paid were starting to demand payment. One of them was a well-known colourful character from around Sydney who started putting the pressure on, and at the end Sayers couldn't resist anymore. He said, "Look, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll meet you down the Sheath Hotel at Double Bay and I'll fix you up. I owe you $120,000. All right. So the well-known bookmaker goes down to the Sheath and he's standing at the bar having a drink, waiting for Sayers to come in, and he looks up and he sees Sayers walking in through the door carrying a suitcase or a briefcase. And thought, oh, that's all right, must have the money. And then two men wearing suits and ties and hats jump out of the corner, grab Sayers, rough him up, drag him out of the hotel with his briefcase, throw him into a waiting car and speed off. And the knockabout SP bookmaker thought, that's interesting, I'll have another beer. So after about 3/4 of an hour, Sayers comes back into the hotel, very dishevelled, looks as though he's had a rough time, carrying this broken briefcase, and says, "You wouldn't believe what happened." And he said, "What?" He said, "I had the $120,000 for you, and I'd just been out and done a heroin deal too. I had a kilo of heroin in the bag as well." He said, "Those rotten police just abducted me as I was coming in here, whizzed me off, took me around the corner and belted me and stole everything. I can't afford to pay you." And the bookmaker looks at him and says, he said, "Actually, I thought I recognised one of those blokes." He said, "Oh, you might, local cops, you never know what they do." He said, "Actually, I thought it was Chris Rent-A-Kill Flannery, your Melbourne criminal." And it was. But it was blokes, stories like that give police a bad name. So there was that. There's also another story which may not have time to go into, I'm not sure, but which is a story that's really been overlooked by the media, and I think it's one of the more significant stories in the book for a number of reasons. One of our most successful and still successful importers is in fact a woman. Known as Aunty, she came to Australia with a family in the 70s, and for almost 2 decades she has been the front of a Sydney-based syndicate whose family operates out of Colombia, and every 18 months or so she imports about 1 tonne of cocaine. Not one of her importations has ever been intercepted that we know of, nor have they found 10 cents of the profits she's made. But if I can give you some indication of the sort of profits she made, probably part of her success has been due to the fact that she only ever deals with 2 or 3 people at any time. So she'll have 2 or 3 principal distributors. During the early 2000s, one of her distributors was a fellow named Shane Hatfield. Shane Hatfield was a professional surfer. He was a violent, nasty person, and he got his kick along in crime when he was attending Alcoholics Anonymous, and he realised one of the other anonymous people at the meeting was a head honcho of organised crime called Michael Hurley. I don't know whether you've heard of him or not. But Michael Hurley was a major player from Balmain, a large professional criminal on a very large scale and a major drug dealer, and was regarded, even during the Woodrow Commission, as a head honcho, as the way he's referred to, of organised crime. Anyway, after one of the meetings, they adjourned to the pub for a drink and realised their interest was in more than beer. They had a common interest in illegal drugs, and they formed a bit of a partnership, a loose alliance from that time. So by the early 2000, by 2002-3, Hatfield was in fact dealing directly with Aunty. Now, I can skip back a bit, one of the people, or one of his partners or associates, was a fellow we'll call Tom. Now, Tom's an informant on witness protection, so that's all we can call him. But Tom's career itself is interesting. He's much younger than Hatfield. He smoked dope at school. The day he left school, he went to work for 2 weeks, but then found it was easier to leave work and set up a drug distribution network. He had relatives who were bikies and were already in the business. So he set up a business in Sydney as a cannabis dealer. He also sold cocaine and ecstasy. He never did a day's work in his life, well, except for those 2 weeks. And as an example of how his business operated, it grew quite rapidly. He gets a call from South Australia from a friend or relative who says, look, we've got a buyer or a dealer in Sydney we deal with. He owes us money. Can you go and talk to him and send him across to us? We'd like to have a talk to him. So fully armed, Tom goes and gets the dealer, ties him up, puts him in the boot of a car. The car's loaded onto a truck and driven to South Australia, where the South Australians talk to the dealer. This person's never been seen since. This came out in some court proceedings not that long ago, and Tom was asked, did this occur? And he said, yes. And they said, well, you've been involved in murder. You're a protected witness, but you're involved in murder. No, I'm not. Never shot, never hurt anyone in my life. Well, at least you've been involved in kidnapping. No, not true. Well, do you remember when you went and got this person and put him in the boot of a car? That's kidnapping, isn't it? No, definitely not. Why not? Well, he never asked to get out of the boot. What he forgot to mention was his mouth was taped up. But that's the sort of person Tom was. Anyway, Tom had also been arrested by police several times and had paid tens of thousands of dollars of each occasion to beat the charge or not be arrested. And by 2004, he and Hatfield were buying off Aunty in big ways. Aunty had just made another importation and they took 200 kilos of cocaine from her. In 6 months, they had sold it. Excuse me. In 6 months, they had sold it for $30 million cash. They kept their share of $6 million, paid out a few expenses, and they gave Aunty $24 million cash. I can say that New South Wales Crime Commission has been pulling their hair out because they couldn't find 1 cent of the $24 million. Aunty had got rid of it. But I just use that to say that is the size of her operation. So one fraction of one importation in 6 months and she's $24 million and has been doing it for 17 years or 18 years or so. It's an enormous operation. And I think for perhaps some of us male chauvinists, it puts us to shame because I can't think of one guy who's been more successful than her and the way she operates. It's really an amazing story. Aunty, just to give an update, Shane Hatfield is in jail. He's attempted suicide a couple of times. Tom, the only honest money, which was a couple of $1 million that he made gambling, he's been allowed to keep. And Aunty is still importing cocaine.
This is ABC Fora.